A man died at 40, his kidneys destroyed by morphine, and his dreams burned to ash. They found him on a sleeping porch in California, surrounded by unfinished manuscripts and unpaid bills. Jack London had written himself to death, producing 50 books in 17 years, chasing a fortune that always stayed just out of reach. But that's not where the story gets interesting. The interesting part is how a bastard child from the Oakland slums became the highest paid writer in America, then destroyed everything he'd built because he couldn't stop running from a truth he discovered when he was 21 years old. January 12th, 1876, San Francisco. A woman named Flora Wellman gives birth in a boarding house near 3rd and Brannan Streets. The father isn't there. He won't ever be there. William Cheney was an astrologer, a journalist, a man who claimed to read futures in planetary alignments, but somehow failed to see his own. When Flora told him she was pregnant, he demanded she abort the child. She refused. According to the San Francisco Chronicle, published months before the birth, Cheney's response was to deny the child was his and walk away. Flora, devastated and desperate, put a gun to her head and pulled the trigger. The bullet missed. Or maybe she missed deliberately. We'll never know. What we do know is that she survived, gave birth, and within months married a different man entirely. John London was a Civil War veteran, partially disabled, struggling to make ends meet in a city that didn't care about broken soldiers. He took Flora and her bastard son and gave the boy his name, Jack London. Not born with it, given it. The distinction mattered, though Jack wouldn't discover just how much until he was 21 and decided to search for the truth about his real father. That search would shatter something fundamental in him, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. The family moved constantly. Oakland, then somewhere cheaper still. Jack later called Oakland the cellar of society, and he wasn't exaggerating. They lived in slums where disease moved through neighborhoods like weather, where children died so regularly that survival itself felt like an accomplishment. Jack's stepfather couldn't work much. His body had been ruined by war, and whatever jobs he could manage paid almost nothing. Flora tried to help, but she was unstable, prone to dramatic episodes that terrified her son. The one constant in Jack's early life was Virginia Prentice. Jenny Prentice was a former slave who lived nearby. After Jack was born, Flora had sent him to Jenny for wet nursing, and Jenny became the closest thing to a mother Jack ever knew. Years later, he'd credit her with teaching him what love actually felt like, with showing him that tenderness existed in a world that seemed designed to crush anyone born without money or status. She called him her white child, and he visited her throughout his life, even after he became famous. When everyone else in his childhood was chaos and instability, Jenny was solid ground, but Jenny couldn't protect him from poverty. By age 10, Jack was working. Not occasionally, not for pocket money. Working because the family needed every penny he could bring home. He sold newspapers on street corners. He delivered ice, hauling heavy blocks up flights of stairs in San Francisco's steep hills. He set up pins in a bowling alley, resetting them by hand between frames, while drunk men threw balls at his head. By 14, he was in Hickmott's cannery, making 10 cents an hour for 12 to 18-hour shifts that turned his hands raw and his mind numb. The cannery was hell. Imagine spending your entire adolescence in a building that smells like fish guts and industrial chemicals, doing the same repetitive motion thousands of times a day, surrounded by adults who've given up on everything except getting through their shift. Jack called it the work beast life, and he saw what it did to people. It hollowed them out, turned them into machines that happened to need food and sleep. He watched men who'd once had dreams become walking corpses, and he understood with terrifying clarity that this was his future, unless he found a way out. The Oakland Public Library saved him, or more specifically, a librarian named Ina Coolbrith saved him. She saw something in this rough kid from the slums, this boy who showed up with dirty hands and devoured books like other kids devoured candy. She guided his reading, suggested authors, encouraged him to keep learning. Years later, she became California's first poet laureate. But in the 1880s, she was just a librarian who believed that a poor kid deserved access to the world that books could open. Jack read everything. At 9 years old, he found a copy of Ouida's novel Signa, and later credited it as the seed of his literary ambitions. He didn't just read for entertainment. He read to escape, yes, but also to understand, to figure out how the world worked and why some people ended up in mansions while others ended up in canneries. The books taught him that the world he lived in wasn't natural or inevitable. It was constructed, which meant it could be changed. But books didn't pay rent. At 15, Jack made a decision that would define everything that followed. He borrowed money from Jenny Prentice, bought a sloop called the Razzle Dazzle from an oyster pirate named French Frank, and became a thief. Not a petty thief, a pirate. He stole oysters from commercial fisheries in San Francisco Bay, sold them to markets, and made more money in a night than he could earn in a week at the cannery. The work was dangerous. The authorities were always hunting for pirates. Other pirates would kill you over territory, but Jack was good at it. Fast, clever, willing to take risks that made older men nervous. Then he switched sides. After a few months as a pirate, he joined the Fish Patrol, the very organisation that had been trying to catch him. Now he was enforcing the laws he'd been breaking, chasing down other oyster pirates, learning both sides of a system that was fundamentally corrupt. The experience taught him something crucial about power and law. They weren't about justice. They were about who had the authority to define what counted as legitimate and what counted as criminal. At 17, he signed aboard the Sophie Sutherland, a sealing schooner bound for Japan and the Bering Sea. It was 1893, and Jack was about to experience something that would change his life more than any book or street fight. The voyage was brutal. Sealing meant killing seals, thousands of them, in conditions that were cold, wet, and dangerous. The crew was rough, the work was bloody, and somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, a typhoon nearly destroyed the ship. Jack survived. More than survived. He came home with stories. His mother saw an announcement for a writing contest in a local newspaper and pushed him to enter. Armed with an 8th grade education, Jack wrote about the typhoon and the terror of thinking you're about to die at sea. He submitted it, and he won. $25. First prize, beating out college students from Berkeley and Stanford. For a kid who'd spent his childhood in canneries, this was revelation. Writing could pay. Writing could be a way out. But before he could pursue that path, he had to understand something about the world that books alone couldn't teach him. In 1894, the country was in the grip of an economic depression. Unemployment was massive. People were starving. A group called the Industrial Army organised to march on Washington and demand government intervention. Jack joined them, not because he had a clear political philosophy yet, but because he recognised the anger and desperation he saw in these men. They were him. They were everyone he'd grown up with. He didn't make it to Washington. The Industrial Army fell apart before reaching its destination. Jack deserted in Hannibal, Missouri, and spent months riding the rails as a hobo, moving from town to town, seeing poverty that made Oakland look prosperous. He slept in fields, stole food when he had to, and learned that the country was full of people who'd been discarded by an economic system that had no use for them. In Buffalo, he was arrested for vagrancy. 30 days in prison. No trial, no lawyer, no chance to explain or defend himself. He was poor and homeless, and that was crime enough. The experience was formative. He witnessed brutality that shocked him even after everything he'd seen on the streets. Guards beating prisoners for minor infractions. Men broken by a system that treated them as less than human. Jack walked out of that prison with a new understanding. The law wasn't neutral. Justice wasn't blind. The entire apparatus of government existed to protect property and punish poverty. That realization could have turned him into a revolutionary. In some ways it did, but it also did something else. It convinced him that he needed to succeed within the system, not outside it. He'd been living on the margins, and the margins were where people got destroyed. If he wanted to survive, if he wanted to have any power to change things, he needed to climb. He needed education. He needed legitimacy. In 1896, after months of intense studying, Jack passed the entrance exams for the University of California at Berkeley. He was 20 years old, older than most freshmen, and desperately poor. He worked while attending classes, barely sleeping, surviving on almost nothing. At Berkeley, he encountered ideas that gave structure to what he'd been feeling. Darwin's theories about evolution and natural selection, Marx's analysis of capitalism and class struggle, Nietzsche's writings about power and the will to dominate. These weren't abstract philosophies, they were explanations for everything he'd experienced. But college cost money Jack didn't have. His stepfather was sick. His family needed support. After less than a year, he had to drop out. He never got his degree. Years later, anti-Stratfordians would use this against him, arguing that someone without formal education couldn't have written the works attributed to Jack London. They missed the point entirely. Jack's education didn't come from professors. It came from oyster pirating and canneries and 30 days in a Buffalo jail. It came from reading Darwin in a winter camp in the Klondike, while his gums bled from scurvy. But we're not in the Klondike yet. Before that, there's one more piece of the foundation that needs to be laid. At 21, while still at Berkeley, Jack decided to investigate his origins. He'd grown up knowing he was illegitimate, but he'd never known the details. He searched through old newspaper archives and found the San Francisco Chronicle article from 1875, the story of his mother's suicide attempt, the name of his biological father, William Cheney. Jack wrote to Cheney, who was living in Chicago. The letter was careful, almost deferential. Jack wasn't looking for money or revenge. He just wanted to know, to understand where he came from. Cheney's response destroyed something in him. The old astrologer denied paternity entirely, claimed he was impotent and therefore couldn't possibly be Jack's father. The letter was cold, dismissive, final. Jack's reaction was extreme. He quit Berkeley immediately. Within months, he was on a boat to Alaska, chasing gold and running from a truth that had shattered his sense of self. The man who'd spent his childhood believing he was John London's son, who'd built an identity around being a scrappy kid from Oakland, suddenly had no idea who he was. Illegitimate didn't just mean born out of wedlock. It meant unmoored, rootless, fundamentally alone in a way that no amount of success or acclaim would ever fully fix. The Klondike Gold Rush of 1897 was calling, and Jack London was about to answer. Not because he believed he'd find gold, but because he needed to find something else entirely. Something that would give him a reason to keep going when everything else had fallen apart. What he found in those frozen wastes wasn't treasure, it was stories. And stories, it turned out, were the only kind of wealth that couldn't be taken away. But first, he had to survive the journey, and survival in the Klondike meant facing cold that could kill you in minutes, starvation that turned men into animals, and a kind of isolation that made you question whether civilization had ever existed at all. The journey to the Klondike started in San Francisco on July 12th, 1897. Jack was 21, broke, and running from a truth he couldn't face. His brother-in-law, Captain Shepherd, agreed to take him along. They had no equipment, no experience, and barely enough money for passage, but thousands of men were sailing north that summer, all chasing the same dream: gold, enough gold to change everything. The boat landed at Dyer, Alaska, a ramshackle collection of tents and false front buildings clinging to the edge of wilderness. This was the gateway to the goldfields, and it looked like the end of the world. From here, the only way forward was up. Literally. The Chilkoot Pass rose ahead of them, a wall of ice and rock that separated Alaska from the Yukon Territory. Jack and his party bought supplies: flour, bacon, beans, coffee, blankets, mining equipment. The Canadian authorities at the border required every man to bring a year's worth of provisions. Anything less and you were turned back. The rule existed for good reason. Men who ran out of food in the Yukon didn't survive to tell about it. The supplies weighed over 1,000 pounds per man. The trail was too steep for horses or wagons, which meant carrying everything on your back, in multiple trips, up a 45-degree incline of ice and mud and loose rock. Men fell, equipment was lost, some gave up and sold their outfits for pennies, heading back to civilization before they had even started. Jack carried 100 pounds at a time. His back screamed, his legs trembled, but he kept climbing, trip after trip, hauling gear up the pass and then descending to get more. It took weeks. Around him, thousands of other stampeders did the same, forming a human chain up the mountainside that never stopped moving, day or night. At the summit, they crossed into Canada and started down the other side. But the descent was almost worse. Steep, slippery, deadly. Men lost their footing and tumbled hundreds of feet. Jack watched one stampeder slide off the trail, his screams cutting off abruptly when he hit the rocks below. No one stopped to help. There was nothing to be done. They reached Lake Linneman and built boats, rough, leaky vessels hammered together from green timber. The entire shore was a construction site. Thousands of men, sawing and nailing, racing to finish before winter closed the lakes. Jack had never built a boat before. None of them had. But you learned fast or you didn't make it. They loaded their supplies and pushed off, joining a flotilla of amateur-built craft heading north. The lakes connected through narrow channels and rapids. Boats capsized. Men drowned. Equipment sank to the bottom. But the flow never stopped. Everyone knew that reaching Dawson City before freeze-up meant the difference between staking claims and waiting out a brutal winter with nothing. Jack's boat made it through. Barely. They navigated Miles Canyon and the Whitehorse Rapids, stretches of water that had already killed dozens of stampeders. The boat took on water. The supplies got soaked, but they survived, and by late September, they were on the Yukon River proper, floating north toward the goldfields. The river was wide and brown, moving at walking speed through endless wilderness. No towns, no people, just forest and water and sky. They drifted for days, seeing nothing but other boats filled with men who looked as exhausted and determined as they felt. On October 9th, they reached Dawson City. The settlement sat at the confluence of the Yukon and Klondike rivers, a sprawling chaos of tents and cabins that had exploded from nothing in less than a year. 20,000 people were crammed into a space that could barely support 2,000. The streets were mud, the buildings were crude, and the good claims were already taken. This was the reality that hit every late arrival. The first wave of stampeders, the ones who'd rushed north the previous year, had staked everything worth staking. By the time Jack arrived, you could buy claims that might contain gold, but finding unclaimed ground with real potential was nearly impossible. Jack and his partners staked 8 claims along the Stewart River, about 80 miles from Dawson. The claims were legal, properly registered, but whether they contained any gold was another question entirely. To find out, they'd have to dig, through permafrost, in winter, with hand tools. First, they needed shelter. They found a cabin site about 70 miles up the Stewart River and started building. Log by log, chinking the gaps with moss and mud, racing against the approaching cold. By the time they finished, winter had arrived in earnest. The temperature dropped to 40 below, then 50. The Yukon froze solid. They were trapped. The river, which had been their highway, was now an impassable barrier of ice. No boats could move, no supplies could arrive. For the next 6 months, they'd be completely isolated, dependent entirely on what they'd brought with them. Jack had packed books. While other men brought extra mining equipment or luxury items, Jack had used precious weight allowance for Darwin's On the Origin of Species and Milton's Paradise Lost. In that freezing cabin while the Arctic winter raged outside, he read. The mining itself was brutal. To reach bedrock where gold might be found, they had to dig through permafrost. The ground was frozen solid to depths of 15 or 20 feet. You couldn't just dig. You had to thaw it first. They'd build fires, let them burn for hours, scrape away the thawed layer, then start another fire. gaining a few inches a day if they were lucky. The work destroyed you. Your hands cracked and bled from the cold. Your back seized up from bending over fires. The smoke made you cough until you tasted blood. And for what? To reach bedrock and find out whether your claim contained anything valuable? Most didn't. Jack's claims were no exception. They dug, they burned, they scraped, and they found nothing worth the effort. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was watching what the Klondike did to men's souls. In Dawson, fights broke out over imaginary slights. Partners who'd been friends turned on each other over suspicions of theft. Men went mad from the isolation and darkness. The town had gambling halls and dance halls and prostitutes, anything to distract from the reality that most people there would leave poorer than they'd arrived. Jack watched it all, absorbing, observing. The brutality wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The Klondike stripped away civilization's veneer and revealed what men became when survival was all that mattered. Then the scurvy started. It always did. Fresh vegetables didn't exist in the Yukon winter. The diet was salt pork, beans and flour. Nothing with vitamin C. After months of this, your gums began to swell. Your teeth loosened, your joints ached. Old wounds reopened spontaneously. Jack's gums started bleeding in early spring. He knew what it meant. Scurvy could kill you if it progressed far enough. He'd seen men die from it, their bodies literally falling apart from the inside. He had to leave, had to get back to civilization before the disease advanced too far. His partners agreed to stay and work the claims. Jack would head downriver as soon as the ice broke. In late May, the Yukon thawed. The ice cracked with sounds like cannon fire, massive sheets breaking apart and churning downstream. When the river was finally clear, Jack and several others built a raft and pushed off. They were floating 2,000 miles through some of the wildest territory on Earth. No settlements, no help if something went wrong. Just the river and whatever they could carry. Jack was in constant pain. His gums were swollen, making it agony to eat. He'd lost 4 front teeth. His legs and hips ached from scurvy's assault on his connective tissue. But he was alive, and he was heading home with something more valuable than gold. He had stories, real stories, about real things that had happened to real people in a place most of the world couldn't imagine. The raft trip took weeks. They passed through stretches of river so remote that days went by without seeing another human being. They navigated rapids, avoided log jams, and survived on dwindling supplies. When they finally reached St. Michael, a trading post on the Bering Sea, Jack was nearly broke. He worked on a boat to earn passage back to San Francisco. By the time he reached California, in late July 1898, he'd been gone almost exactly 1 year. He returned with less money than he'd left with. His health was wrecked. His face bore scars from scurvy that would never fully fade. He was 22 years old and looked 30. His stepfather had died while he was gone. The family was deeper in debt than ever. Jack needed work immediately, but his health made physical labour impossible. His swollen gums and aching joints meant he couldn't return to the cannery or the waterfront. He had one option left, the thing he'd decided years ago, after winning that writing contest. He'd become a writer. But deciding to be a writer and actually making a living at it were completely different things. Jack had no connections, no formal training, no published work except that one contest story from years ago. What he did have was a year's worth of experiences that other writers couldn't match. He'd been to the Klondike. He'd seen men at their worst and their best. He'd nearly died from cold and hunger and disease. He started writing every day, relentlessly. He set a goal of 1,000 words daily and stuck to it even when every word felt like pulling teeth. He wrote stories about the Yukon, about the men he'd known, about the brutal reality of life at the edge of civilization. The first stories were terrible, rejected by every magazine he sent them to, but Jack kept writing, and slowly, incrementally, he got better. He learned structure, he learned pacing, he learned how to make readers feel the cold and taste the fear. In December 1898, the Overland Monthly accepted his story to The Man on Trail. They paid him $5. It was the first money he'd ever made from writing fiction. $5 for a story that had taken him weeks to perfect. But it was a start. It meant someone, somewhere, thought his work was worth printing. More acceptances followed. Small payments from small magazines. The Black Cat bought 1,000 Deaths for $40. The Overland took more Klondike tales. The money was nowhere near enough to live on, but it was something. Proof that this insane plan might actually work. Jack was living in a rented room in Oakland, writing until his hands cramped, surviving on almost nothing. His mother and his stepsister needed support. He needed to eat. The pressure was constant and crushing, but the alternative was going back to manual labour, and Jack had made a decision. He would succeed as a writer, or he would starve trying. By mid-1899, he'd placed enough stories that magazines started seeking him out. The Atlantic Monthly, the most prestigious literary magazine in America, accepted An Odyssey of the North. They paid $120. Jack couldn't believe it. More money than he'd made in months of cannery work for a story about the Klondike. The Klondike was his material, his edge. Every other writer was working from imagination or research. Jack was writing from memory, from experience, from truths he'd lived. He knew how permafrost felt when you dug through it. He knew how scurvy tasted. He knew the exact sound of ice breaking on the Yukon in spring. That authenticity showed in every line. Readers could feel it. Editors could sense it. This wasn't someone making things up. This was someone who'd been there, who'd survived, who was reporting back from a place most people would never see. But Jack wasn't content with short stories. He needed something bigger, something that would establish him as more than just another magazine writer. He needed a book, and in the summer of 1899, he started writing one. The book was about a dog. That's all it was supposed to be. A simple story about a domesticated animal stolen from California and thrust into the harsh world of the Yukon as a sled dog. Jack started writing it with no grand ambitions. He needed money. He needed to establish himself beyond magazine stories. A novel would do that. He called it The Call of the Wild. The writing came fast, faster than anything he'd written before. The story poured out of him in weeks, not months. Maybe it was because he wasn't overthinking it. He was just telling what he knew. The cold, the violence, the transformation of a creature forced to survive in conditions that stripped away everything civilized and revealed something primal underneath. Buck the dog was stolen from a comfortable life and sold into service, beaten, starved, worked until his paws bled. And through that brutality, he discovered something. Strength he didn't know he possessed. Instincts buried under years of domestication. The wild calling him back to something ancient and true. Jack finished the manuscript in late 1902, 30,000 words. He sent it to Macmillan, one of the biggest publishers in America. They loved it, wanted to publish it immediately. But there was a problem. They offered him $2,000 for all rights to the book, forever. No royalties, just a flat payment. $2,000 was a fortune to Jack, more money than he'd ever seen at once. But it also meant he'd never make another cent from the book, no matter how well it sold. He thought about negotiating, asking for a better deal. Then he looked around his rented room, thought about the bills piling up, his family depending on him, the constant pressure to produce. He took the $2,000. The Call of the Wild was published in July 1903. It was an immediate sensation. Critics praised it. Readers devoured it. The book sold thousands of copies in the first weeks, then tens of thousands. It became one of the fastest-selling novels in American publishing history, and Jack London made exactly $2,000 from it. Not a penny more. He watched his masterpiece become a phenomenon while he scrambled to pay rent. Macmillan made a fortune. Jack made what he'd been paid up front. It was a mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his life, but it also taught him something crucial about the business of writing. Never sell yourself short. Never give away your rights. Always negotiate. But the book did something money couldn't measure. It made Jack London famous, not magazine famous, not writer's circle famous, actually famous. People across America knew his name. They quoted his descriptions of the Yukon. They talked about Buck's transformation like it meant something beyond entertainment. Because it did mean something. The Call of the Wild wasn't just an adventure story. It was about what happens when civilization falls away, when comfort and safety disappear, when you're forced to become what you were always meant to be beneath the layers of social conditioning and modern life. Jack had lived that. The Klondike had stripped him down to essentials, shown him what he was capable of when survival was the only thing that mattered. He'd put that experience into Buck. The dog's journey was his journey. The wild calling Buck back was the same force that had driven Jack to the Yukon in the first place. Readers sensed that authenticity. They could feel that this wasn't fiction invented at a desk. This was something real, channeled through the story of a dog. Success brought new problems. Jack was suddenly in demand. Magazines wanted more stories. Publishers wanted more books. Everyone wanted a piece of him. And he needed the money. Always needed the money. So he gave them what they wanted. He wrote The Sea Wolf in 1904. Another instant success. The story of a brutal ship captain and the people trapped under his command. It sold even better than The Call of the Wild. This time Jack negotiated a better contract. Royalties, percentage of sales. He was learning. But he was also learning something darker. The faster he wrote, the more money he made. The more money he made, the more he spent. The more he spent, the faster he had to write. It was a cycle that accelerated with every success. Jack bought a house in Oakland. Not a mansion, but something substantial. A real home for his family. Then he bought land. Then more land. He invested in schemes that promised returns, supported friends who needed help, gave money to socialist causes he believed in. The spending matched the earning, which meant he could never stop writing, never take a break, never slow down. The 1,000 words a day became non-negotiable. If he didn't write, he couldn't pay his bills. If he couldn't pay his bills, everything would collapse. His personal life was collapsing anyway. He'd married Bessie Madden in 1900. Before the success, before the fame. She was practical, sensible, good with money. Exactly the kind of stable partner a struggling writer needed. They had 2 daughters together, Joan and Bess. Jack loved his daughters, but the marriage was wrong from the start. Bessie wanted a conventional life. A husband who came home at reasonable hours. A family that did normal family things. Jack wanted adventure, freedom, experiences that would feed his writing. The more famous he became, the more he chafed against domestic constraints. In 1903, he met Charmian Kittredge. She was 5 years older than him, educated, adventurous. She rode horses and sailed boats and didn't care about conventional propriety. She read philosophy and talked politics and understood what Jack was trying to do with his writing in a way Bessie never had. Jack fell hard, started an affair, tried to hide it, failed miserably. The scandal broke in 1904. Newspapers loved it. Famous writer leaves wife and children for older woman. The socialists who'd embraced Jack as one of their own turned on him. How could he preach about workers' rights and social justice while abandoning his family? Jack didn't care. He was done pretending. Done with a marriage that felt like suffocation. He moved out, filed for divorce. The whole thing was messy and public and damaging to his reputation. Cost him friendships, cost him support from political allies who championed him, but he married Charmian anyway. In November 1905, the day after his divorce was finalised, she became his partner in everything, his companion on trips, his first reader for new work, the person who understood that his need to write wasn't a job, but an obsession that consumed him completely. They tried to have children. Charmian got pregnant. They were excited, planning for a family. Then she miscarried. They tried again. Another pregnancy, another loss. This time, a daughter who died shortly after birth. The grief was devastating. Charmian fell into depression. Jack threw himself deeper into work. Writing became his escape from everything, from grief, from financial pressure, from the criticism that followed him everywhere. He could lose himself in stories, control the narrative in ways he couldn't control his own life. He wrote White Fang as a companion piece to The Call of the Wild, the reverse journey, a wolf dog moving from wild to civilized instead of civilized to wild. It was good, successful, but Jack knew he was repeating himself, trading on what had worked before instead of pushing into new territory. The problem was that publishers and readers wanted more of the same, more Yukon stories, more dogs and wolves and brutal survival tales. Every time Jack tried something different, sales dropped. Every time he returned to familiar territory, sales climbed. So he compromised, gave them what they wanted while sneaking in what he wanted to say. The Iron Heel, published in 1908, was a dystopian novel about a fascist oligarchy crushing workers' rights. It was his most political book, his attempt to use fiction as a weapon for social change. Critics hated it, called it propaganda, too preachy, too obvious. Sales were disappointing. Jack didn't care. He'd said what he needed to say, used his platform for something beyond entertainment. But the failure stung, reminded him that his influence had limits, that most readers didn't want politics in their adventure stories. They wanted escape, not lectures about economic inequality. He kept writing, kept producing stories, novels, essays, journalism. The output was relentless. Between 1900 and 1910, Jack London published over 20 books, plus hundreds of stories and articles. It was an insane pace, unsustainable. His health started to crack. The scurvy from the Klondike had left permanent damage. His teeth were bad, his joints ached constantly. He developed kidney problems, probably from the intense physical stress of those early years combined with the mental stress of constant deadlines. Doctors told him to slow down, rest more, write less. He ignored them. Slowing down meant less money. Less money meant losing the lifestyle he'd built, the houses, the land, the ability to support not just himself and Charmian, but his mother, his daughters, various friends and causes. Besides, writing was who he was. Take that away and what was left? A former oyster pirate with an 8th grade education, a has-been adventurer living on past glory. The writing validated him, proved he was more than his origins, more than the poverty he'd escaped. So he pushed harder, drank more, coffee to wake up, whiskey to relax, whatever it took to maintain the pace. The 1,000 words a day became a prison instead of a discipline. Some days the words came easy, most days they didn't, but he forced them out anyway, because stopping wasn't an option. In 1907, Jack and Charmian decided to sail around the world. They commissioned a boat, the Snark, named after Lewis Carroll's nonsense creature. The plan was to spend 7 years circumnavigating the globe, writing about their adventures, living the kind of life Jack had always dreamed about. The Snark was a disaster from the beginning. The boat was poorly built, leaked constantly, cost twice what they'd budgeted. They set sail anyway. Hawaii first, then the Marquesas, Tahiti, Samoa. The journey was everything Jack wanted. New places, new experiences, material for dozens of stories. But his health got worse. The tropical climate aggravated conditions he didn't know he had. Skin infections, digestive problems. Something was wrong. Multiple things were wrong. He tried to ignore it, keep sailing, keep writing, keep moving. By the time they reached Australia in 1908, Jack was seriously ill. Doctors examined him, found multiple issues, recommended he return to California immediately for treatment. The 7-year voyage ended after less than 2 years. They sold the Snark and went home. Jack was 28 years old and his body was falling apart. The years of physical labour as a teenager, the Klondike, the constant stress of deadlines and financial pressure, the drinking. All of it catching up at once, but he couldn't stop. The bills kept coming. The responsibilities kept mounting. He'd bought more land in Sonoma Valley, was planning to build a ranch, a real working ranch where he could apply scientific agricultural principles, prove that modern methods could make farming profitable and sustainable. It was another obsession, another project that consumed money and energy he didn't have. But Jack needed something beyond writing, something tangible, something that would last after he was gone. The ranch became his new dream, bigger than writing, bigger than fame. He was going to revolutionize farming in California, show that intelligence and planning could triumph over tradition and superstition, create something permanent. He threw himself into it with the same intensity he brought to everything. Bought more acres, imported special livestock, built barns and irrigation systems, hired workers, studied agricultural journals, made plans and kept writing, always writing. Because the ranch needed money. Everything needed money. The only way to get money was to produce more words. The property grew. 130 acres became 400, then 800, then 1,400. Jack kept buying adjacent parcels. Couldn't help himself. Every piece of land represented possibility. Another field to cultivate, another hillside to terrace, another acre to transform from barren soil into productive farmland. He called it Beauty Ranch. The name was aspirational. Most of the land was worn out. Decades of poor farming had depleted the soil. Erosion had carved gullies into the hillsides. The previous owners had extracted everything they could and given nothing back. Jack saw potential where others saw waste. Scientific agriculture could restore it. Modern methods, crop rotation, terracing to prevent erosion, imported livestock with superior genetics. He'd read everything: agricultural journals, scientific papers, government reports. He was going to prove that intelligence and planning could make farming profitable. The irony didn't escape him. The socialist who railed against capitalism was becoming a landowner on a massive scale, but he justified it. This wasn't exploitation. He paid his workers well, better than most ranchers. He was creating something, building instead of destroying. And besides, someone had to demonstrate that there was a better way. The ranch consumed money faster than writing could generate it. Eucalyptus trees to prevent erosion, a concrete silo that cost a fortune, purebred livestock from across the country, equipment, buildings, infrastructure. Every improvement required capital. And Jack kept spending, kept planning, kept expanding. In 1911, he started designing a house. Not just any house, a mansion that would last 1,000 years. Stone and redwood, 4 floors, 26 rooms, built to withstand earthquakes and fire and time itself. He hired Albert Farr, one of San Francisco's top architects, spared no expense on materials or craftsmanship. Wolf House, that's what he called it. His monument, his permanent mark on the landscape. The house would outlive him, would stand as proof that Jack London had been here, had mattered, had created something beyond words on paper that could be forgotten or go out of print. The construction took 2 years, cost multiplied beyond initial estimates. Jack didn't care. He borrowed more, mortgaged the ranch, kept writing to fund the building. This was his legacy, the thing that would remain after he was gone. By August 1913, Wolf House was nearly complete, just finishing touches left. Jack and Charmian prepared to move in. After years of living in a cottage on the property, they'd finally have the home Jack had envisioned. The dream was about to become reality. On the night of August 22nd, Jack woke to shouts, looked out the window, saw flames. Wolf House was burning. He ran, tried to get inside. The heat drove him back, stood helpless as fire consumed everything. The redwood, the stone. 2 years of work, all that money, all those plans. By morning, only ruins remained. Walls still standing, but gutted. Roof collapsed, interior destroyed. The house that was supposed to last 1,000 years hadn't survived a single night. Arson was suspected. Disgruntled workers, socialists who saw Jack as a traitor to the cause, business rivals, enemies he'd made through his writing. The investigation found nothing conclusive. No one was ever charged. The cause remained officially undetermined. Jack tried to act stoic, told people he'd rebuild, made plans for Wolf House 2. But something broke in him that night. The financial loss was catastrophic. $50,000. Maybe 75, gone. But worse was the psychological blow, the dream destroyed, the legacy erased before it could begin. He never rebuilt, couldn't afford it. The debt from the first house still needed paying, and deep down, he'd lost faith in the idea. If Wolf House could burn before he even moved in, what was the point? Nothing lasted, nothing was permanent. Better to focus on things that generated income rather than consumed it. The ranch remained. The writing continued, but the fire marked a turning point. After Wolf House burned, Jack's health deteriorated faster. The stress, the financial pressure, the crushing realization that his grand plans kept failing. His kidneys were failing. Years of alcohol abuse catching up. The tropical diseases from the Snark voyage still causing problems. Digestive issues that doctors couldn't diagnose properly. Pain that became constant. He started taking morphine for the pain, and opium, both legal, both available over the counter. Doctors prescribed them freely. Jack told himself he was being practical, managing symptoms so he could keep working. The alternative was being bedridden, useless. The drugs helped initially, dulled the pain enough that he could sit at his desk, produce his 1,000 words, keep the income flowing. But tolerance built quickly. He needed more to achieve the same effect, then more again. The line between pain management and addiction blurred and disappeared. By 1914, Jack was visibly deteriorating, only 38, but looking older. The athletic physique gone soft, the handsome face puffy and marked by broken blood vessels, teeth yellowed from smoking. Despite doctors telling him he had throat cancer, he couldn't quit. He kept taking assignments, war correspondent in Mexico in 1914, covering the revolution. The same restless energy that had driven him onto the Snark drove him to Vera Cruz, chasing stories, chasing experiences, running from the reality of his failing body. Mexico was brutal. Heat, disease, danger. Jack's health couldn't handle it. He came back worse than when he left, but he'd gotten his stories, sent dispatches back to the papers, earned his fee. That's what mattered. The writing quality was declining. He knew it. Critics knew it. Readers started to notice. The fire that had animated his early work was dimming. Too many books published too quickly. Stories that felt recycled. Characters that resembled previous characters. Plots that echoed earlier plots. But he couldn't slow down. The ranch needed money. Charmian needed support. His mother and daughters needed help. Various causes and friends needed assistance. The machine had to keep running. So he wrote, even when it hurt, even when the words came hard, even when he knew what he was producing wasn't his best work. Hawaii became a refuge. Charmian convinced him to spend time there in 1915 and 1916. The climate was gentler than California, the pace slower. Jack could rest, recover, maybe write something good again without the constant pressure. He tried, produced some stories, but even Hawaii couldn't fix what was broken. His body was shutting down, the kidneys especially, uremia setting in, poison building in his blood because his organs couldn't filter it out properly. The morphine and opium made everything worse. His kidneys couldn't process the drugs. The toxicity increased, but without them, the pain was unbearable. He was trapped, needing the drugs to function. The drugs destroying the organs he needed to process them. Doctors urged him to stop drinking, change his diet, get more exercise, rest. He refused most of it. Couldn't rest, couldn't stop. The financial pressure was too intense, the responsibilities too heavy, the fear of failure too great. In his lucid moments, Jack knew he was dying, not immediately, but soon. The trajectory was clear. His body couldn't sustain this pace much longer. But what was the alternative? Stop writing and lose everything? Declare bankruptcy? Admit defeat? He'd escaped poverty through sheer will and talent, built himself into someone who mattered, someone whose name meant something, someone who travelled the world and had adventures most people only read about. He couldn't go back to being nobody, couldn't let it all slip away. So he pushed, wrote through the pain, drank to numb it, took drugs to make it bearable, ignored the warning signs his body kept sending, told himself he just needed to get through this next book, this next payment, this next deadline, then he'd rest. The ranch projects continued. Even as his health failed, Jack kept planning improvements, new crops to try, different livestock breeds, better irrigation systems. He couldn't stop dreaming, couldn't stop trying to build something that would last. Martin Eden haunted him. The novel he'd written in 1909 about a writer who achieves success and finds it empty, who realizes that fame and money don't fill the void, who ends up so disillusioned he kills himself. Jack had written it as semi-autobiography, a warning to himself about the dangers of success. Now, in 1916, lying in bed with pain radiating through his body, kidneys failing, morphine barely touching the agony, he understood Martin Eden differently. Not as a warning, as prophecy. The success he'd chased so desperately had destroyed him, just as surely as poverty would have. Different mechanism, same result. He thought about the Klondike sometimes. That year in the frozen north when he was 21 and healthy, and the whole world seemed full of possibility. When he'd read Darwin and Milton by candlelight in a cabin and believed that understanding the world was the key to conquering it. He'd been so certain then, so confident that intelligence and will could overcome any obstacle, that a poor kid from Oakland could become whatever he decided to become. And he had. He'd done it. Become famous, become wealthy, become Jack London. But what had it cost? His health, obviously. His teeth lost to scurvy in the Klondike. His kidneys destroyed by tropical diseases and drug abuse. His liver damaged by decades of drinking. His throat cancerous from endless cigarettes. His relationships too. The first marriage ended because he'd chosen ambition over family. The second marriage strained by his obsessions and his health and his inability to simply be present instead of always chasing the next thing. And his writing. The thing that had saved him. The thing that had lifted him out of poverty and given his life meaning. It had become a trap. A job he couldn't quit. A responsibility that crushed instead of liberated. The irony was sharp. He'd become a wage slave just like the factory workers he'd written about. Different collar, same chains, trading his health and time and talent for money he immediately spent on projects that consumed more money. An endless cycle with no escape. On November 21st, 1916, Jack's pain was worse than usual. He took more morphine than prescribed, needed it to sleep. Charmian worried but didn't stop him. What could she do? Let him suffer? He went to bed that night in the sleeping porch of their cottage. Not Wolf House. That dream had burned. Just the simple cottage they'd lived in while waiting for the mansion that never was. The next morning, November 22nd, Charmian found him unconscious. Called the doctors. They came quickly, did what they could. But Jack's kidneys had finally given out completely. Uremic poisoning. The toxins his body couldn't process had built to fatal levels. He died that day without regaining consciousness. 40 years old, one of the most famous writers in the world, and completely broke despite a lifetime of earnings that should have set him up for generations. The official cause was uremic poisoning, but the real cause was more complicated. Decades of pushing too hard, working too much, drinking too much, taking too many risks with his health, refusing to slow down or stop or admit that he was mortal after all. Some people whispered suicide, the morphine overdose, the timing, the way he'd been talking about death in recent months. But there's no evidence he intended to die that night. More likely, he was just trying to manage pain that had become unmanageable. And his body, already failing, couldn't handle the additional insult. They cremated him, scattered his ashes on the ranch he'd loved, and bankrupted himself trying to improve the beauty ranch that had consumed so much money and energy and hope, the land he'd tried to transform into something permanent. Charmian stayed there, kept the ranch going as best she could, published Jack's remaining manuscripts, managed his legacy. She'd been his partner in all of it, the adventures, the writing, the dreams. Now she was the keeper of his memory. The books remained. That was the legacy that actually lasted. Call of the Wild, White Fang, The Sea Wolf, Martin Eden, dozens of others. They kept selling. Keep getting read. Keep finding new audiences. Wolf House ruins still stand. Tourists visit them. Walk through the skeleton of Jack's dream. See the massive stone walls that survived the fire. Imagine what it would have been like if it had been completed. But maybe the ruins are more fitting, more honest, a monument to ambition that exceeded grasp, to dreams that couldn't be sustained, to the gap between what we envision and what we can actually build. Jack London's legacy is complicated. He wrote stories that millions of people loved, still love. Call of the Wild has never gone out of print. White Fang gets assigned in schools. The Sea Wolf remains a classic of maritime literature. But the man who created these enduring works was also deeply flawed. Racist in ways that were extreme even for his era, believing in white supremacy with the same intensity he brought to everything else. His essays and novels contain passages that make modern readers cringe. The Asian characters in his work are stereotypes, caricatures based on prejudice rather than observation. His views on racial superiority weren't just background assumptions of his time. They were explicit arguments he made repeatedly. The Yellow Peril was a real concern for London. He genuinely believed Asian immigration threatened white civilization, wrote about it, lectured about it, made it central to some of his fiction. This wasn't subtle. This was overt ideology woven into adventure stories and political essays. How do we reconcile this? The brilliant storyteller who gave us Buck's transformation in the Yukon with the man who wrote racist screeds about Asian immigrants? There's no clean answer. You can acknowledge the art while condemning the artist's views. Recognize that people are contradictory, contain multitudes. Some of those multitudes are ugly. London's socialism was equally problematic. He advocated for workers' rights, while believing those rights belonged primarily to white workers. He saw class struggle, but viewed it through a racial lens that distorted everything. The People of the Abyss showed genuine empathy for London's poor. His reporting from the slums was compassionate, detailed, angry at the systems that created such suffering. But that same compassion didn't extend universally. His circle of concern had boundaries. Racial boundaries he defended as natural and necessary. This contradiction runs through his entire body of work. Stories celebrating nature's indifference to human hierarchies, alongside essays insisting on white superiority. Fiction that questions social Darwinism next to non-fiction that embraces it. The ranch itself became a different kind of legacy. After Jack's death, Charmian stayed, maintained the property, continued his agricultural experiments with less grandiosity but more sustainability. She lived there until 1955, nearly 40 years after Jack died. The beauty ranch became her life's work, preserving his memory, managing his literary estate, keeping the dream alive in modified form. The ruins of Wolf House attracted visitors, even then, people fascinated by the burned mansion, the stone walls that survived, the massive fireplaces standing in what should have been the Great Hall. Today, it's a state park. Jack London State Historic Park. Visitors can walk the property, see the cottage where he died, visit the ruins, stand where the grand house almost was. His grave is there too, a simple marker near where they scattered his ashes. No grand monument, just a boulder with a plaque. The kind of natural memorial he probably would have preferred to something more elaborate. The books kept selling after his death, still do. Call of the Wild alone has sold millions of copies, been translated into dozens of languages, adapted for film multiple times. There's something in that story that speaks across cultures and generations. The transformation of Buck from pampered pet to wild creature, the return to primal origins, the discovery of strength through hardship. It resonates because it's archetypal. Joseph Campbell would later identify the pattern: the hero's journey, separation, initiation, return. London was writing mythic structures without necessarily knowing it. White Fang works the same way in reverse. The journey from wild to domestic, from survival mode to trust, from violence to love. Same archetypal power working in the opposite direction. These stories transcend their author's limitations. They touch something universal about transformation and adaptation and finding where you belong. Martin Eden is different, more personal, more painful. A writer's journey from poverty to success, to disillusionment. Jack's most autobiographical novel, and his darkest. Eden achieves everything he wanted. Fame, money, recognition, and discovers it means nothing. The success feels hollow. The literary world he fought to enter seems shallow and corrupt. He kills himself, walks off a ship into the ocean, chooses death over continuing in a world that no longer makes sense to him. London wrote this in 1909, 7 years before his own death, already feeling the emptiness that success had brought. The realization that achieving your dreams doesn't necessarily make you happy. Critics have argued for decades about how autobiographical Martin Eden really is, how much Jack saw himself in Eden's despair, whether the novel was a warning or a prediction. Either way, it's his most psychologically complex work, the character study of a man destroyed by getting exactly what he wanted, unable to find meaning in accomplishment. The Sea Wolf is equally dark, but in different ways. Wolf Larsen is London's most memorable villain, a Nietzschean Superman who lives by strength and will. No morality beyond power, no sentiment beyond what serves his interests. He's terrifying because he's intelligent, articulate, capable of explaining and defending his philosophy with eloquence. He's not a simple brute, he's a thinking monster, and London makes him compelling. That's the disturbing part. Wolf Larsen's arguments are presented with enough force that readers feel their pull. The seduction of might makes right thinking. The novel doesn't endorse Larsen's philosophy. The protagonist, Humphrey Van Weyden, rejects it. But London gave Larsen the better lines, the more powerful presence, the character who dominates the book. There's a fascination there. London exploring ideas he found attractive, even as he tried to critique them. The same tension that runs through all his work. His short stories show different facets. To Build a Fire is his most famous. A man alone in extreme cold, makes a series of small mistakes, dies. It's brutal in its simplicity. Nature doesn't care about your survival. The universe is indifferent. Your resourcefulness and intelligence mean nothing if you miscalculate the temperature, or your fire goes out. The story works because London knew that cold, had felt it in the Klondike, understood how it kills. The specific details come from lived experience. Love of life is similar. A man injured and abandoned, crawling through wilderness, barely surviving. The will to live reduced to its most basic form. These stories strip away civilization, show humans as animals fighting for survival. No philosophy or politics or social theory, just the raw struggle to keep breathing. London was good at this. The elemental conflicts, man versus nature, man versus beast, man versus his own limitations. His adventure fiction pioneered what would later be called survival literature. the genre of extreme environments and desperate struggles. He established many of its conventions. The non-fiction work is less remembered, but equally significant. The People of the Abyss influenced social reform movements. His war correspondence from the Russo-Japanese War was widely read. John Barleycorn helped shape early conversations about alcoholism. He was a journalist as much as a novelist, reporting from places and situations most writers avoided, using his experiences as material for both fiction and non-fiction. The distinction between the two wasn't always clear in his work. He fictionalized real events, drew non-fiction from fictional techniques. The boundaries were porous. Modern scholars study him as a cultural figure, representative of his era's contradictions. Progressive politics combined with reactionary racial views. Celebration of individualism alongside socialist organizing. Nature worship mixed with social Darwinism. He embodied tensions that defined turn-of-the-century America. The country was industrializing rapidly, cities growing, immigration changing demographics, old certainties dissolving. London tried to make sense of these changes through his writing, sometimes insightfully, sometimes revealing his own prejudices and blind spots. His influence on later writers is undeniable. Hemingway learned from London's stripped prose. Kerouac borrowed his wanderlust. Steinbeck absorbed his sympathy for workers. The adventure genre he helped create spawned countless imitators. Wilderness survival stories, man versus nature tales, stories of transformation through hardship. Even his failures are instructive. The ranch that bankrupted him, Wolf House that never stood, the marriage that fell apart, the health that collapsed. These weren't just personal tragedies, they were the consequences of living too intensely, pushing too hard, refusing to accept limits. There's something very American about Jack London's trajectory. The belief that willpower can overcome anything, that success is just a matter of working hard enough, that you can reinvent yourself completely. He proved it was possible. Poor Kid becomes famous author, but he also proved it wasn't enough. That success doesn't automatically bring satisfaction or peace. The Beauty Ranch still operates, not as London envisioned. No grand agricultural experiment, just a working farm and historic site, modest, sustainable, more realistic than his dreams. Wolf House ruins remain unrestored, preserved as they are, walls standing open to sky, stone fireplaces leading nowhere, a monument to ambition that exceeded practical limits. Maybe that's the most honest memorial. Not the grand house he planned, but the evidence of its failure. The gap between vision and reality made permanent. His books sit on shelves worldwide, get assigned in classes, adapted into films, analysed in dissertations. The words outlasted the man by a century and counting. That's the legacy that actually endures. Not the ranch or the house or the politics. The stories, the characters, the prose that still grabs readers and pulls them into worlds of ice and wilderness and survival. Call of the Wild keeps finding new audiences because the story still works, because Buck's transformation still resonates, because something about that journey from civilization to wildness speaks to something deep in human psychology. We're all domesticated animals who remember being wild, or think we do. The fantasy of shedding civilization and returning to something more authentic. London gave that fantasy powerful expression, made it concrete, gave it narrative shape that readers could inhabit. That's what writers do at their best. Give form to feelings and ideas that exist as vague impulses, make them specific enough to be shared. Jack London did that. For all his flaws and contradictions and problematic views, he created stories that endure, characters that live, prose that still has power. The man died at 40, but the work survived. That's the paradox. The flesh fails, the words remain, and those words kept selling. Through the 1920s, through the Depression, through World War II, different generations finding different meanings. Adventure readers wanted the action, socialists claimed him as comrade, nature enthusiasts loved the wilderness descriptions. Something for everyone. That's part of why he endured. The books worked on multiple levels. You could read Call of the Wild as simple adventure, dog survives in wilderness, or you could read it as allegory about civilization versus nature, about finding authentic self, about evolution and survival. London probably intended all those readings. He was calculating that way, knew his audience, knew what sold, but he also believed what he wrote. The contradiction never bothered him. Art and commerce weren't separate in his mind. Good stories should sell. Popular didn't mean shallow. He proved that repeatedly. The racism in his work can't be ignored. It's there, explicit in some stories, implicit assumptions throughout. Anglo-Saxon superiority, social Darwinism applied to human races. This was common in his era, but that doesn't excuse it. Modern readers rightfully object. Some of his work has aged terribly. Because of this, the racial theories he absorbed and promoted were wrong, harmful. They undermined his socialist ideals. You can't preach working-class solidarity while maintaining racial hierarchies. The contradiction was obvious even then. Critics pointed it out. London never resolved it. His response was usually to double down, defend his positions, cite pseudo-scientific sources. He was wrong and stubborn about being wrong. This creates a problem for his legacy. Do we dismiss the entire body of work because parts are racist? Do we read him only as historical artifact, product of his time? Or do we try to extract what's valuable while acknowledging what's harmful? There's no easy answer. Different readers make different choices. What's clear is that pretending the racism doesn't exist is dishonest. It's woven through his worldview. It affected what he wrote and how he wrote it. The alcoholism was another thread running through everything. John Barleycorn, his memoir about drinking, is brutally honest about alcohol's role in his life. He started young. Drinking was part of waterfront culture, part of adventure culture, part of writer culture. He drank heavily for years. It damaged his health, contributed to kidney failure. But he also romanticized it, made it part of his masculine image, the hard-drinking writer, the man who could outdrink anyone. This was performance too, like everything else about his public persona. The book itself is strange, part memoir, part temperance tract. He argues against alcohol while describing its appeal, the warmth, the camaraderie, the way it loosens inhibitions, makes life seem bigger, more vivid. Then he shows the cost, the blackouts, the wasted time, the physical deterioration. He published it in 1913, 3 years before his death, already knowing alcohol was killing him, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop, or wouldn't. The distinction hardly matters. Charmian stuck with him through all of it. The drinking, the health problems, the financial stress, the failed dreams. She was his companion on the Snark voyage, his nurse during illnesses, his secretary and organizer. After his death, she became his literary executor, managed his estate, defended his reputation, published 2 volumes of biography. She shaped how the public remembered him, emphasized the adventure, the vitality, downplayed the darkness. This was understandable, protecting her husband's legacy, but it created a sanitized version, the Jack London of popular imagination, adventurer, naturalist, socialist, leaving out the alcoholism, the racism, the personal cruelties. Later biographers had access to more material, letters, unpublished manuscripts, financial records. They built more complete picture, more complicated, less heroic in simple terms. The man who emerged was brilliant and flawed, visionary and blind, generous and selfish, all of it true simultaneously. That's usually how people are, but we want our cultural heroes simpler, either saints or villains. London resists that categorization. He did important work. He also caused harm. Both things are real. His influence on American literature specifically is hard to overstate. He proved you could write about working people, about nature, about adventure, and be taken seriously. Literary critics might sneer, but readers devoured his work. Other writers noticed. Hemingway's stripped prose owes debt to London's directness. Steinbeck's sympathy for workers echoes London's socialism. The whole tradition of American adventure writing traces lineage through him, some of it good, some derivative trash, but he opened that territory. The environmental writing particularly feels modern. His descriptions of wilderness, his attention to animal behaviour, his sense that nature operates by its own logic, indifferent to human concerns. This wasn't sentimental nature writing, no pathetic fallacy, no projection of human emotions onto landscape. The wilderness in London's work is beautiful and deadly. It doesn't care about you. Survival requires respecting that reality. This perspective influenced later nature writers. Edward Abbey, Barry Lopez, Annie Dillard. They all read London, all absorbed his unsentimental approach. The socialist writings had different trajectory, initially influential, read widely in labour movements, but his brand of socialism was idiosyncratic, mixed with social Darwinism, with individualism, with racial theories. As socialist movements developed more sophisticated analysis, London's work seemed crude, contradictory. By mid-century, it was mostly forgotten, except as historical curiosity. The literary work survived. The political writings didn't, except as examples of early American socialism, studied more than embraced. His science fiction is an interesting case. Before Adam imagines prehistoric humans, The Scarlet Plague depicts post-apocalyptic California. The Iron Heel presents dystopian future. These weren't fully realized as science fiction, more like thought experiments, but they showed genre's possibilities, influenced later writers. H.G. Wells was doing similar work in England. London was American equivalent, not as skilled at sustained narrative, but asking similar questions. What if civilization collapsed? What would remain of human nature? How would people survive? The short stories contain some of his best work. To Build a Fire is masterpiece of economy. Man versus environment. No wasted words, pure narrative drive. Love of Life shows similar mastery. Survival against impossible odds. These stories work because London knew the territory, had experienced extreme conditions, could write authentically about cold, hunger, exhaustion, fear, the physical reality of survival. His novels are more uneven, some brilliant, Call of the Wild, White Fang, The Sea Wolf, others forgettable, written too fast, too much plot, not enough development. He knew this himself, complained about having to churn out words for money, but he'd built lifestyle that required constant income, the ranch, the entertaining, supporting family and friends. He was trapped by his own success, had to keep producing. Quality suffered as quantity increased. The beauty ranch itself became burden rather than refuge. He kept expanding, more land, more projects. Scientific agriculture required investment, equipment, labour, experimentation. Not all experiments succeeded, losses mounted. He borrowed against future earnings, expected next book to solve problems. Next book never did. The cycle continued until his death. Charmian wrote that he died still planning. New books, new projects, new adventures. He never accepted limits. This was his strength and weakness. The refusal to compromise, to slow down, to acknowledge physical reality. It produced extraordinary work. It also killed him. At 40, the death itself remains somewhat mysterious. Official cause was uremic poisoning, kidney failure, but morphine overdose was suspected, possibly intentional, possibly accidental. He'd been in severe pain, taking morphine regularly, easy to miscalculate dosage or to decide pain wasn't worth enduring. Charmian insisted it was accident, natural death. Maybe she believed that. Maybe she protected his reputation. We'll never know for certain. What we know is that he died November 22nd, 1916, in cottage on his ranch, surrounded by unfinished manuscripts, unpaid bills, grand plans that would never materialize. Charmian found him, called doctors, too late. The man who'd survived Klondike and Pacific voyages and poverty and prison couldn't survive his own body's breakdown, his own refusal to rest. The funeral was small, private, cremation, ashes buried on ranch property. Under rock he'd selected years earlier. Simple marker, no elaborate monument. He'd rejected traditional Christianity, didn't want religious service. Just quiet burial in place he loved. The ranch he'd bankrupted himself trying to perfect. His death made headlines. Around the world. Famous author dead at 40. Tributes poured in. Some sincere, some perfunctory. Socialist newspapers mourned comrade. Adventure magazines celebrated storyteller. Literary journals offered measured assessments. Everyone claimed piece of him. Everyone emphasized different aspect. The man himself disappeared under interpretations. Charmian spent remaining years managing estate, publishing his work, writing about their life together. She presented version of Jack London she wanted remembered. Adventurer, writer, lover of life. Some of that was true, but not complete picture. She knew the complexity, chose to simplify for public consumption, for his legacy, for the books kept selling. Through 20s, through depression, through war, each era found something relevant. Depression readers saw worker solidarity. War readers saw survival skills. Post-war readers saw wilderness escape. The stories adapted to whatever readers needed. That's mark of lasting work. It survives changing contexts, remains relevant across decades. By 1960s, he was being rediscovered. Counterculture embraced his anti-establishment stance. Environmentalists claimed his nature writing. New Left appreciated his socialism. Despite its flaws, he became symbol of radical American tradition. This wasn't entirely accurate, but movements need symbols. London served that purpose. Academic study increased. Dissertations written. Critical editions published. Scholars examined archives. Revealed complexity. Earlier biographies had smoothed over. The racism, the contradictions, the personal failures. More complete London emerged. Less heroic, more human. This created backlash. Defenders wanted to preserve legend. Critics wanted to demolish it. The work itself got somewhat lost in debate about the man. But readers kept reading. Not academics, not critics. Regular people picking up Call of the Wild, White Fang, Sea Wolf. The stories still worked, still grabbed attention, still created worlds readers wanted to enter. That's what mattered ultimately. Not critical reputation, not political correctness. Whether the books still found audience? They did. They do. Current moment is complicated for London. His racism disqualifies him from some readers. His environmental sensibility attracts others. His working class sympathies resonate with some. His social Darwinism repels others. He's too contradictory for simple evaluation, too problematic to celebrate uncritically, too talented to dismiss entirely. We're stuck with the complexity. Have to accept he was brilliant and limited, progressive and reactionary, visionary and blind. His books remain in print, get assigned in classes, adapted for screen, translated into languages he never imagined. The words keep traveling, finding new readers, creating new meanings. That's the legacy that actually endures, not the man, not the politics, not the theories, the stories themselves, characters who live, prose that still has power. The Beauty Ranch operates as state park now. Visitors can tour grounds, see Wolf House ruins, Walk trails London walked, its educational site, historic landmark, not working farm, not grand agricultural experiment, just place where famous writer lived and died. That's honest at least, preserves what actually existed, not fantasy version. The writing remains. That's what survives. Everything else fades, the personality, the politics, the personal drama. But Buck's transformation endures. White Fang's journey persists. The man freezing to death in Yukon still grips readers. These stories transcend their creator, exist independent of his biography, his beliefs, his flaws. That's what literature does when it works, outlasts its moment, survives its author, finds new readers who bring new meanings. London created that. Despite everything, despite contradictions and failures and early death, he made something that lasted. The work survived. That's the final measure, not the theory behind the work, not the man's intentions. What actually appears on the page, that's all we can judge with certainty. Think about what endures from any writer. Not their personality, not their politics, the specific sentences they constructed, the images they created, the moments they captured. London gave us Buck answering the call, White Fang learning to trust, the man whose fingers froze before he could light the match. These scenes live independent of their creator's flaws. They function regardless of what London believed about race or economics or social order. That's uncomfortable for some. We want our artists to be heroes, want to celebrate them without reservation. London doesn't permit that. Neither do most writers, if we're honest. We have to separate the work from the worker, judge the creation apart from the creator. It's the only way forward. Current readers approach London differently than previous generations. We see the racism they overlooked or excused, notice the gender assumptions they accepted as natural, recognize the colonial mindset they didn't question. This doesn't make us superior. We have our own blind spots. Future readers will notice things about our era we can't see. That's how culture works. Each generation finds new problems in old texts, new meanings in familiar words, but Call of the Wild still grabs readers, still creates that primal connection between human and animal, still captures something about wildness and civilization that resonates across time. You can acknowledge the book's flaws and still recognize its power. Both things are true simultaneously. Same with To Build a Fire. The story works, man versus nature, intelligence versus instinct, the inevitability of death in extreme conditions. London captured something essential about survival, about the thin line between life and death in wilderness. The story doesn't care about his other beliefs, it functions on its own terms. That's what we mean by literary merit. The work transcends its context, operates independently, creates effects that persist across changing values. Not every London story achieves this. Some are dated, some are offensive, some are just bad writing. But the best ones still work, still do what literature is supposed to do, make us see differently, feel deeply, think newly. The question becomes, what do we do with problematic classics? Ignore them? Teach them with disclaimers? Cancel them entirely? There's no perfect answer. But erasing them doesn't erase the problems they reveal. The racism in London's work shows us what early 20th century America actually believed. Pretending those beliefs didn't exist doesn't help. Understanding them might. Context matters, not as excuse, as explanation. London wrote within specific historical moments, absorbed specific cultural assumptions, expressed them in his work. We can acknowledge this without endorsing it, study it without celebrating it, learn from it without repeating it. His socialism is similarly complex. He believed in workers' rights, fought for labour, supported strikes, wrote exposés of poverty, all genuinely progressive for his era. But his socialism was mixed with social Darwinism, with belief in racial hierarchy, with acceptance of violence as natural. These contradictions coexisted in his mind. They coexist in the work. We can't make him consistent, can't smooth out the contradictions, can't turn him into hero we wish he'd been. We're stuck with the actual man, the actual beliefs, the actual work, all of it complicated, all of it mixed. Nothing pure, nothing simple. That's probably more honest anyway. People are contradictory, contain multitudes, believe opposing things simultaneously. London exemplifies this. Fought for justice while accepting hierarchy. Loved nature while exploiting it. Championed workers while chasing wealth. He was human, messy, inconsistent, like everyone. His influence continues in unexpected ways. Contemporary survival writers owe debt to London, whether they know it or not. The genre he helped create persists, gets updated, evolves, but the basic template remains. Person versus environment. Civilization versus wilderness. These themes still resonate. Environmental writers claim him too. Despite his contradictions, his nature writing influenced how Americans think about wilderness, about conservation, about relationship between humans and natural world. Not always in ways he intended, but influence spreads beyond intention. The ranch he built still stands. State park now. Tourists visit, walk the grounds, see Wolfhouse ruins. It's memorial of sorts to his ambitions, his failures, his dreams. The physical space preserves what actually existed. Not sanitized version, real thing, incomplete, imperfect, true. His grave is simple marker, in Glen Ellen Cemetery. Nothing grand, nothing ornate, just name and dates. Seems fitting for man who wanted to be buried on his own land. Wanted to return to earth he'd worked. His ashes scattered there, on property he loved. Despite everything, despite the disappointments, he chose that place, made it home. Charmian outlived him by nearly 40 years, died in 1955. She preserved his papers, protected his reputation, wrote her own books about their adventures, shaped how he'd be remembered. That's powerful influence, widow controlling narrative, deciding what gets emphasized, what gets buried. She had her own agenda, her own needs, her own version of events. The papers eventually went to Huntington Library, available to scholars who discovered complexity she'd hidden, found contradictions she'd smoothed over, revealed man more interesting than legend, more flawed, more human. That's probably appropriate. Truth tends to emerge eventually. Archives don't lie the way memory does. What remains clearest is the work itself. 19 novels, 18 short story collections, hundreds of articles, massive output in short career. Some brilliant, some mediocre, some terrible. But the volume is staggering. He wrote constantly, produced relentlessly, maintained output despite pain, despite illness, despite everything. That dedication is undeniable. The best work still matters. Call of the Wild, White Fang, Sea Wolf, To Build a Fire, Martin Eden. These aren't perfect books, but they're powerful ones. They accomplish something. Create worlds, develop characters, tell stories that grip readers. That's achievement regardless of author's other failures. Would he have written differently if he'd lived longer? Impossible to know. 40 is young. He might have evolved, grown beyond his prejudices, developed new perspectives, or he might have calcified, become more rigid, doubled down on existing beliefs. We'll never know. Death at 40 froze him in time, prevented growth, prevented decline. We're left with what he actually produced, not what he might have created. That's true for all writers who die young. We wonder about lost potential, imagine unwritten masterpieces, but we only have what exists. The actual books, the actual words, everything else is speculation, wishful thinking, projection of our own desires onto absence. London's actual legacy is concrete. The books that exist, the stories that persist, the influence on writers who came after. Not imagined works, not potential achievements, what actually happened, what actually remains. That's enough to evaluate, more than enough. His life story itself became legend. Poor boy makes good. Self-educated writer conquers literary world. Adventures in exotic locations. Early fame. Tragic, early death. It's almost too perfect as narrative. Too neat. Real life is messier. But the legend persists because it's compelling. Because people want to believe in it. Because it offers hope. That hope is real, even if details are complicated. He did rise from poverty. Did educate himself. Did become successful writer. Those facts remain regardless of contradictions. They mean something, especially to readers from similar backgrounds, who see possibility in his trajectory, who believe they might do something similar. The work speaks for itself ultimately. You can read Call of the Wild without knowing anything about London's life. The book functions independently, creates its own world, tells its own story. Biography adds context, complicates understanding, but the book exists separate from all that, has its own integrity, its own power. That's what survives. The words on the page, the stories themselves, everything else is interesting, informative, worth knowing, but secondary. The primary thing is the work. Whether it still moves readers, still creates effects, still matters. By that measure, London succeeded. The books remain. Get read, get assigned, get discussed. That's literary immortality, not perfect reputation, not universal admiration, continued relevance, continued readership, continued life. 40 years wasn't enough time. He had more stories, more ideas, more things to say, but what he managed to produce in those 40 years exceeds what most writers produce in twice that time. The output is remarkable, the quality uneven but often extraordinary, the influence undeniable. Jack London died November 22nd, 1916. The work lived on. Still lives. That's what matters. That's what lasts. Not the man. The work, the words. The stories that refuse to die. That keep finding readers. That keep mattering. That's the real legacy. The only one that counts. We judge artists by what they leave behind. Not intentions, not potential. What actually exists. London left 50 books, hundreds of stories, essays, journalism, massive body of work produced in 16 years of professional writing. From 22 to 40. That's all he had. Made it count. The contradictions don't resolve. Can't resolve. He was product of his time and rebel against it simultaneously. Fought for workers while exploiting them on his ranch. Loved nature while consuming it. Preached equality while believing in hierarchy. These tensions run through everything. Make him harder to categorize, harder to dismiss, harder to celebrate without reservation. Modern readers approach him warily, aware of the racism, uncomfortable with the social Darwinism, appreciative of the nature writing, drawn to the adventure. We pick and choose, take what works, critique what doesn't. That's probably honest approach, better than hagiography, better than dismissal. His influence on American letters is undeniable, regardless of how we judge the man. He proved working-class stories could sell. Nature writing could be literary. Adventure fiction could contain ideas. Other writers learned from this, built on his foundation. The tradition of American adventure writing traces directly through him. The environmental movement claims him despite his contradictions. His descriptions of wilderness influenced how Americans think about natural world, about conservation, about humanity's place in larger ecosystem. Not because he was consistent environmentalist, he wasn't, but because his prose made wilderness vivid, made readers care about places they'd never see. His socialism failed to create lasting political movement, too contradictory, too mixed with other ideologies, but The People of the Abyss remains a powerful document of poverty. The Iron Heel still reads as prescient warning about fascism. These works matter even if his overall political philosophy doesn't cohere. The personal story continues to fascinate. Illegitimate birth, poverty, self-education, adventure, success, addiction, early death. It's archetypal American narrative. Rags to riches to ruin. We keep returning to it, keep trying to understand what drove him, what destroyed him, what he accomplished despite everything. Beauty Ranch stands as monument to his ambitions. Wolf House ruins show the gap between vision and reality. The cottage where he died reminds visitors of mortality. Physical spaces preserve truths biography might obscure. The dreams were too big, the body too fragile, time too short. Charmian's role deserves recognition. She preserved what mattered, protected the work, ensured his books stayed in print. Her biography shaped his legend, made him accessible to new generations. That's contribution that matters. Literary executor who understood value of what she was preserving. The books themselves remain the point. Call of the Wild sells because Buck's transformation still resonates. White Fang endures because the journey from wild to domestic contains emotional truth. To Build a Fire grips readers because survival stories tap something primal. These aren't historical artifacts, they're living texts that continue to work. We can't make London perfect, can't erase his flaws or excuse his prejudices, can't pretend he was hero he sometimes claimed to be. But we can recognise what he achieved. The stories that last, the prose that still has power, the influence on writers who came after. That's legitimate legacy, worth preserving, worth studying, worth reading despite complications. Every generation rediscovers London differently, finds new meanings in old texts, emphasises different aspects. Our era sees the racism previous generations ignored, notices the environmental themes they missed, values the working class perspective they took for granted. Future readers will find things we're missing. That's how literature works, keeps revealing new dimensions across time. His death at 40 robbed us of later work. We'll never know what he might have written with more time, more maturity, more distance from youthful certainties. The trajectory was upward when it ended. The best work came late. Martin Eden, John Barleycorn, the later short stories. He was still developing, still growing as artist. Then it stopped. The manner of death matters less than the fact of it. Whether morphine overdose was intentional or accidental doesn't change outcome. He died too young. Body destroyed by decades of abuse. Kidneys failed. Pain unmanageable. The end was probably inevitable. Only the timing was question. He was buried on land he loved. Ashes scattered on ranch he'd bankrupted himself building. That choice tells us something. Despite failures, despite disappointments, despite knowing the agricultural dreams wouldn't work. He chose that place, made it home, wanted to remain there permanently. The grave is simple marker, no grand monument, just name and dates, appropriate for man who rejected traditional religion, who wanted to return to earth without ceremony, physical body back to soil, the work living on in different form. That's what happened. The flesh decayed, the books persisted, words printed and reprinted, translated into dozens of languages, read by millions of people London never imagined. The influence spreading in ways he couldn't have predicted. That's literary survival. Not the man remembered, the work continuing to live. We study London because he matters, not perfectly, not without problems, but substantially. His books shaped how Americans think about wilderness, about adventure, about class struggle, about survival. These contributions are real even when complicated by his flaws. Teaching his work requires context. Students need to understand the racism, the social Darwinism, the contradictions. But they also need to encounter the prose, Experience the storytelling. Feel how the best passages still work. Education means both critical analysis and aesthetic appreciation. Neither alone is sufficient. The legacy is mixed, like the man, like the work, nothing pure, nothing simple, brilliant prose alongside offensive ideology, genuine insight mixed with blind prejudice, environmental wisdom combined with exploitative practices. We're stuck with all of it. Can't separate the good from the bad cleanly. Have to grapple with complexity. That's probably appropriate. Great writers are rarely simple people. Their work reflects their contradictions. Their genius coexists with their limitations. London exemplifies this pattern, makes it impossible to ignore, forces us to confront the fact that literary merit doesn't require moral perfection. His books will outlast current debates about his character. Call of the Wild will be read when we're forgotten. The arguments about whether he was racist or sexist or problematic will fade. But Buck's journey will persist. The story transcends its creator's flaws, exists independently, matters on its own terms. That's what literature does when it works. Outlives its moment, survives its author, finds new readers who bring fresh interpretations. London created that, made something larger than himself, something that escaped his control, something that keeps growing and changing and mattering. 40 years of life, 16 years of writing, 50 books, thousands of pages, influence on generations of writers and readers. That's the accounting. That's what remains. Not perfect legacy, but substantial one. Not hero without flaws, but writer who created work that lasts. The Beauty Ranch sits quiet now. Tourists walk trails, photograph ruins, visit museum, read about the man who lived here, dreamed here, died here. The land he tried to transform outlasted him, survived his schemes, absorbed his ashes, continues without him. That's probably fitting end. Man returns to earth. Work continues in world. Stories find new readers. Legacy grows more complicated as time passes. More complete, less heroic, more true. Jack London died November 22nd, 1916. The work survived. That's all that matters. That's all that lasts.